This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io.
Hey everybody, we are back for session 2, and we have an amazing speaker and someone I love, respect, and is my friend Rachel Cherry speaking to us about JavaScript accessibility and WordPress. Rachel, do you want to drop for us your 2-sentence text on there so that people can read if they are readers and listen?
Yeah, let's see. Chat. I do have that ready. Oh, here we go. Ta-da.
Yay! Rachel Cherry. Her pronouns are she, her, is a freelance software engineer and consultant with over 10 years of experience in back and front end web development and digital design. Her main areas of focus include accessibility, higher education, and WordPress. And today we're going to be hearing about JavaScript accessibility and WordPress from the one and only Rachel. I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Happy Friday. Assuming it's Friday, where most of you are. My name is Rachel, and we're going to talk today about accessibility in relation to JavaScript. So let me share my screen. We're going to talk today about JavaScript accessibility and WordPress. And who am I? Again, I am Rachel Cherry. I have a lot of experience in regards to higher education and accessibility and WordPress. I am the director of WP Campus, which is an organization for people that use WordPress in higher ed, which where I get a lot of my accessibility experience from is the world of higher ed. And if you're unfamiliar with laws like Section 508, a lot of higher education institutions fall under this law that requires your technology, all technology, not just websites, to be accessible. So I have been working in higher ed since 2007 and am pretty well versed in this field, in this area. And so if you do work in higher ed, hi. If you don't work in higher ed, hi. It's a great community and industry altogether to be in. It's very fulfilling. If you do work in higher education or you want to learn more about what we're doing, we actually do have an event coming up in 2 weeks, which is blowing my mind. But if you can't make it out to Portland because actually registration's closed, we are live streaming our sessions. So if you like these kinds of live online conferences, you can join us via the internet and watch our sessions, where we also will have a lot of sessions focused on accessibility, aside from a lot of basic WordPress sessions and higher ed sessions. So for our discussion today, we're going to stay pretty high level. We're not going to get into any specific weeds. My hope today for you is to take some nuggets away that you can go and dive into on your own. But we are going to cover three areas. What is accessibility and why is it important? I don't know how many of the listeners, viewers today are familiar with accessibility. So I hope to cover that a little bit. It is a very important topic. A lot of today we're going to talk about the Gutenberg Accessibility Audit, which is an interesting topic and valuable topic for anyone in the WordPress community in general. It's something big that happened at the end of last year, earlier this year, that shed a lot of light on accessibility in our community, especially in relationship to JavaScript, considering the nature of Gutenberg. But what I want you to take away from our discussion about the audit is these very deep dives into accessibility issues in relationship to JavaScript, because you can use these issues in a wide variety of contexts. They don't have to be inside of Gutenberg. You can take a lot of these lessons that we learned from the audit and apply them to pretty much any JavaScript application that you build. So you want to go build another app to use inside of WordPress. I highly recommend after today that you take the audit report that we're going to go over and you dive into it into detail, because it is amazingly valuable. There is so much information that is free to you because of the hard work of those who created the audit. And then throughout this discussion, throughout the audit, you will learn a little bit and a few nuggets on how to create accessible JavaScript, and hopefully really the key important factors when it comes to making sure your JavaScript is accessible. So let's dive in. What is accessibility? So web accessibility refers to a practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites. And ultimately what this means is that the web is kind of in rough shape, and there are people like myself that have to advocate for this practice of making sure that we are creating accessible technology. And ultimately what that means is creating usable technology. Because when it comes down to it, everyone uses technology differently. I can see perfectly fine. I can use my hands. I can use a mouse. I am a power keyboard user. I like to tab through websites a lot and use the return key and use the tab key to interact. Someone else might not be able to see, so they might navigate your website using different technology than I use your website. They probably use something called a screen reader that reads your website aloud to them, so that they might navigate using a keyboard or another assistive device. Excuse me. Someone else might not be able to use a mouse or a keyboard at all, and they use assistive technology that allows them to click through your website, very much in a manner of someone tabbing through your website. And so we have to keep this in mind when we're building the web. We have to design for our users. Unfortunately, what happens a lot is we will build websites, and because it works for us, we think it works for everyone. And this is where a lot of problems get started, and why a lot of people, myself included, have to advocate for this practice of making sure that we are building our websites in a way that everyone can use. And the interesting thing about this is that a lot of people think accessibility is an add-on, that you are having to go in and add extra functionality to create accessible technology, when that is far from the truth. By default, the web is accessible. And I don't know how many viewers were around when the web was born, or the internet was born, and websites were born. But HTML by default is accessible. It was built in a way to talk to your browser, and the assistive technology was built in a way to talk to to parse that HTML and interpret that for the user. So if you're unfamiliar with kind of how the web sort of works on the back end, it's pretty relatable to JavaScript in the sense that HTML works in a document model. We call that the DOM a lot of times, the document object model. Web browsers take your HTML, they parse it into an object model, and then there are accessibility APIs that are used by assistive technology, and it parses the document object model, and because of that information, it relays that information to the user using the technology. And so, by default, the document object model, will pull in paragraph tags, and since the technology will know how to interpret those tags, it will pull in header tags, and the technology knows how to, take those header tags and present them to the user. And so, basically, a lot of the problems that we see from inaccessible websites is there's invalid HTML markup. And we are creating websites incorrectly a lot of the times, because the cold hard truth is, if your website isn't accessible, it's because you made it that way. And that's hard for a lot of people to hear. I can't sit here and say that I've made 100% accessible websites, but I learned and I got better at it. but it is the truth. The web by default is accessible, and when our websites are inaccessible, it's because we built our website incorrectly. And that's also really hard for anyone listening who maybe is not necessarily a developer, but they are someone who implements a lot of plugins. Or if you are a developer and you implement a lot of third-party scripts, if you put something on your website, you are responsible for that. You are responsible for what you put on your website. So if you are using these third-party scripts, or you're using third-party plugins that add their own scripts, and those products are inaccessible, it is your responsibility to push back on that developer, to point it out to the developer, to try and fix it, or to use something else. Because a very big picture of what it means to build accessible websites is I'll just put them all out here. Understanding diverse needs. One thing to keep in mind going forward, that we talked about, all users use technology differently. We have to keep this in mind. And what this means, kind of going back to what I said earlier, what this means for a lot of people and where they fall short on creating accessible websites is they're not testing. You're sitting there using your mouse and clicking around, and then it works, and you think that you're done. But are you testing for a keyboard? Are you testing for a screen reader? Have you ever, used a screen reader? I highly recommend you check that out. There's a built-in one on Macintosh computers called VoiceOver. It's pretty straightforward to use. There's lots of tutorials. I have a nice little post-it note on my keyboard that has all the keyboard shortcuts for using it. Are you doing automated testing? Also, a big part of this is having thoughtful design. So what this means is if you are building out a complex application, let's just say like Gutenberg, then what this means is that you need to sit down and think about all of your functionality, all of your components, and beforehand, before you start building it out, because you need to think about how all these things are interacting with each other. One of the big problems that JavaScript introduced to websites is it became really easy to manipulate the DOM. Before that we had our HTML and it was super basic. And yes, the websites, back in the 90s, for a lot of them looked super basic, but they were probably more often than not accessible because they were so basic. And then we introduced, more complicated CSS, and we introduced complexity and issues in regards to design, which also plays into accessibility when you think about people who have limited or low vision or no vision. When you think about people that have trouble with color contrast and they can't see your colors that you're using, or because they have low vision, they can't see the font size you're using because it's too small. We could talk about accessibility for a long time. Let's get back to JavaScript. So in came JavaScript, and we opened this whole new world of being able to manipulate the DOM on the fly. The problem with that and the struggle and the issues it created is that we were manipulating the DOM on the fly. And for a lot of people, what they don't think about while you are moving all these things around on your page is that you might be, not only could you be invalidating the DOM and creating invalid markup, but devices that depend on the DOM not only being valid but being structured in a certain way are more likely to be confused. It's more of a challenge for, say, like screen readers. If you are, if you are moving things around on your page, so like imagine the Gutenberg blocks and when you move them around and what that might look like for someone who can't see them move around and what that experience is like. And the big picture takeaway from if you want to be a JavaScript developer building websites is that as much, as we all love JavaScript, HTML is really what's most important for making sure that we have usable, accessible, and valid websites. And because when it comes down to it, HTML is the web. JavaScript's fun and all, but what JavaScript was made to do was to manipulate HTML. And so to kind of wrap this all up, one of the biggest struggles that accessibility advocates and professionals like myself find when it comes to finding accessibility issues is that the majority of them are issues because developers are using invalid HTML. So please keep this in mind. One of the biggest takeaways that I hope you get from learning about accessibility is that one of the most important things you can do is make sure that you understand the HTML spec, that you are using it correctly, because this will make a huge difference. It'll make a huge difference in your websites altogether, but also it will make you a better JavaScript developer, because as you are moving things around on your web page and modifying the DOM and manipulating it, if you understand the spec and you understand how to use it correctly, then you are going to have far less issues when it comes to accessibility. So this little takeaway that from one of my tweets, when people hire me to come and fix their issues, the solution is never, you need to pile more functionality on top and make your JavaScript like more complex. And the solution is always that you need to simplify your design and you need to rewrite your code. And so yeah, so the big takeaways from all that, HTML is really what's important. We need to be thinking about our users and how diverse they are and how diverse their needs are. And we need to be thinking about our design and the effect that it has and what we're going to do with it before we get started. We need to keep our complexities down. So some big high-level JavaScript tips there. Let's dive into the audit. So if you aren't familiar with the accessibility audit, late last fall, the WP Campus organization, which I'm the director of, sorry, I lost the word for it. We initiated an audit, that's not the word. But Gutenberg was coming out. There was a lot of lack of understanding, lack of knowledge on whether or not Gutenberg was actually accessible. And the problem that this created, especially for our organization, is that a lot of our members in WP Campus work for higher educational institutions, which fall under Section 508, which means they're required by law to meet certain accessibility standards. So it's not just a matter of these institutions using Gutenberg, because if they were to just go and immediately start using it without knowing whether or not it's accessible, they could run the risk of being sued and breaking the law. So our organization thought it was prudent to initiate this audit. We put out a request for proposals. We had 7 businesses respond with their proposal. We went with a company called Tenon. We did a lot of fundraising in the community, in the WordPress community, which was great. We raised over $10,000 towards the audit, which ultimately cost $31,000. It takes a lot of time and people to do this kinds of testing, especially when you are talking about Gutenberg, which is a fairly complex application that has a lot of functionality and a lot of interaction. So if you want to go and read more about that whole process and read all the documents, you can visit that URL on the page. And what we got earlier this year, I believe it was March, was the report and the results. And if you haven't had the chance to look at that, there's a 32-page executive summary that I highly recommend you read, and a 329-page report that lists out all of the issues that it found. And so what I wanted to do was, this is the report, this is the executive summary. And I won't go too into the weeds with the summary because we only have so much time here today and you can read that on your own. But the high level summary of the summary is that they found a lot of issues. And ultimately they found issues that can be fixed, but, oops, sorry, I thought I was doing a page down. But it's really extensive in their data in the sense of how they tested it and what they found and what it means. And the really great part is that it lists exactly how to fix it. On top of that, they went in GitHub and created about 90 issues on the Gutenberg repo. So you can go on GitHub and you can find all these issues and you can check on their status. I know that a lot of the WordPress teams have been working really hard on those issues, and a lot of them have been fixed, which is really great. So if you're interested in how these audits work, these PDFs are a really great resource. They talk about the 9 participants that participated in the usability study. 3 were blind, 2 had motor impairments, 1 had cognitive impairments, 2 had mobility impairments, 1 was visually impaired. And basically for each thing, each participant had to perform 3 tasks: create new content, edit content, and amend post options. And what that means is, like the sidebar, changing the settings, things like that. And so you can go through here and you can kind of see the completion rate, which is really interesting. Sadly, there were a lot of not acceptable scores for usability. And this, I'll zoom back out, but the SUS scale is an interesting way. So, let's see if they have a system usability scale is a questionnaire that people use to measure effectiveness. And it's a pretty interesting system. They use that to judge completion rates. And so, yeah, so it's really great. And then it's a really great report. Even the executive summary is just really detailed, even though we haven't even gotten into the meat of the problems. And like I said, this is really great information for you to check out while you're, if you're wanting to be a JavaScript developer, because this is the kind of things that you will need to think about when you're building these complex applications. And I'm trying to get down to the bottom to the conclusion. And basically, they talk, oh, I'm so sorry. When I zoomed in, it kind of messed me up there. And they talk here that it does have problems, and the likes of which, were a step backwards. And, there were pretty serious issues with Gutenberg in relationship to accessibility, and a lot of it had to do, with JavaScript. So these are things for our viewers here today to think about. And what this really all means in the sense of how important it is to create accessible applications, especially in the WordPress ecosystem, because it's pretty large, right? Like, I don't remember what the latest numbers are, but we're talking about, 30-something% of the web. And the things that we create are being used by millions of, people and thousands of websites. And, what we build matters. And, what we publish matters. And what we put out in the world, people are watching. People are watching what we're doing. And not only that, but they're copying and pasting what we're doing. And that, for me, is one of the, the big things to hit home, is that what we publish and what we put into core and what you put into your plugins, people are taking that and they're forking it, or they're copying and pasting. If you're a person who writes blog posts and shares stuff, people are copying and pasting that. And so when you publish an accessible code, you don't know the effect that you're having, even from not just your users, but for other people's users. And so how important it is to check out this, to study this information, to keep these issues in mind, to do this testing. And so let's dive into the technical report and go over some of the actual issues that we found. So this is the actual technical report, and I won't go over all 329 pages because that took me a whole weekend to read this thing. So they do go into pretty hardcore detail. And so they break it down into different content types. So we have color, and we won't focus too much on the color, but keep in mind that people with low vision or color contrast issues, there are lots of standards around the colors you use. And the fact that if you use, and the fact that color cannot be all you use to signify something. So for example, there's a reason that that links are underlined, because that signifies an action. And if you had an action by color alone, then and someone can't see that color, and there's no way for them to know there's an action. So that's why we have underlines, and that's why underlines on links are so important, and that it's not the practice to remove those from your links. So there were a fair amount of issues in Gutenberg in the sense of there was just really low color contrast. And so if someone has low vision, then it's really hard for them to see. So example here on this page, when they have an empty block, you have these icons that are highlighted in red, and it's just really hard to see them if you have low vision. And so like a solution is to, make them, to increase the contrast, make them a little bit darker, and then it's better for all users. Let's try to find those issues more in line to JavaScript. So a lot of the common problems that you'll see in JavaScript mostly have to do with A, state management, and B, the same thing, state management and really focus. And so a lot of times you'll have inaccessible JavaScript apps because like someone will say click a button, and which will move a bunch of things around on the page, and then if that button had focus and you forgot to add it back, or you removed it, or you replaced that element altogether, then the person who was using a keyboard to tab through your website and click that button, their focus is now lost. So a lot of what happens in Gutenberg is that things are moving around, blocks are moving around, buttons are being clicked, things are changing, and for someone who can't see what's happening, they are confused. They've lost their focus on the page, and so that is something really important to keep in mind. Another important thing to keep in mind what they talk about here is insufficient labeling and inappropriate nesting of forms. So forms can be a big accessibility issue, especially in JavaScript and in applications like this, because you do have forms. You have lots of forms involved. And if someone can't see the form, then they're relying on your valid HTML to understand what the form is about and what the fields are. And this is a big issue. And so what this issue is talking about is that if someone's using the media library, then there's not appropriate labels to tell people what's going on in this mode. So there are a fair amount of media library issues that I recommend you check out. It is pretty interesting. There were a lot of media library issues. And so let's try to get back down to the focus. So we'll come here first. So this whole section is on dynamic content. The other big, aside from focus and state management, the other big common issue in regards to JavaScript and accessibility are dynamic content, basically the word I've been using the whole time about manipulating the DOM and moving things around. So this whole section talks about that in regards to Gutenberg. And what this is a lot of issues in regard to assistive technology, mostly screen readers. So Imagine that you can't see the page and you have all those blocks, all those Gutenberg blocks. When things are moved around and blocks are moved around and things are changing visually on the screen, we have to make sure those changes are announced to screen readers. And this is where an HTML spec comes into play called ARIA, and why it's important to understand ARIA. And so this whole section talks about how to remediate these issues by basically making sure that ARIA is used appropriately. And what ARIA does is, ARIA was introduced not long after JavaScript was introduced, basically because we found HTML to be a little lacking in the sense of how much metadata it can share with users. And I do have this example I want to pull in because I forgot to copy and paste it over. But imagine a progress bar on your screen. How many people have used this to show information? And so before ARIA, you would have this kind of div at the bottom, and that would be like all you could do. The rest is CSS, and there was no way to show this information. So ARIA was introduced to fill a gap between, what the HTML attributes that you could use that were provided to you and information that was really helpful to give to screen readers. So this is an example of a progress bar with ARIA in the sense that now we have, not only do we have roles that tell screen readers, what an object is, in the sense this is a progress bar, but now we can give it values and information. So in regards, though, to Gutenberg, what was really important is using something called ARIA Live, which allowed you to give alerts and to put information that would be announced to the user. So when things are moved around visually, you can use ARIA Live to announce to the screen reader that something is happening. So ARIA is really important for you to dive into as a JavaScript developer to show, to make your apps even more accessible to those who don't consume your app visually. So you'll see a lot of these in the report in the sense of there's a lot of information that just wasn't exposed to the screen reader, and most of the remediation involves, so for example, in this example, they would tell you that an image was restored successfully in this little pop-up. We see this common, what are these things called? The notices. We see these common notices all the time, but they'll pop up at randomly, or in other words, dynamically on a page, but they won't be read aloud and announced to screen readers. And so you'll see a few issues with that. And here's the remediation. And basically, as we saw in that previous slide, usually the remediation is adding the alert role. And that will announce to screen readers that there's a new message. So definitely dive into a lot of these in the report. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to go over everything in this report. I wanted to show you how informative it is, and to really encourage you to dive in and read it. It's super valuable, and you will learn a lot. And you'll be more cognizant of these things. You'll be more cognizant of possible issues. The more you find, diagnose, and fix these issues, the more that you will become comfortable with them, the more you will begin to think about them as you develop, before you publish. And this will become second nature, as opposed to what happens a lot where people will build all these things out, publish them, and then have to go back and fix them because they got an audit or they got sued. I will make sure that I do point out that just because you don't fall under Section 508, it doesn't mean that you don't need to be accessible. Section 508 is the only law in the United States, at least, that requires accessibility. And it's basically, it's for people that are federal. Basically, the law is for federal agencies and those that support federal agencies. So let's say you're a small business and you have a small business website and it doesn't fall under Section 508, so you're not required by law to be accessible, but people are sued all the time. And it's becoming more and more common. And they're civil cases, but so they're civil cases, but they happen all the time. For example, there's a lot of big business examples in the sense of, I don't know who's all familiar with Winn-Dixie, which is a grocery chain based out of the South, Florida, I believe. They were sued a couple years ago, which set a lot of precedent and case law in regards to accessibility, because not only did the judge determine that they have to be accessible and that they technically lost the suit, but in return, they had to not only make the website accessible, but going forward, they had to provide annual training for all of their employees, and they had to publish an accessibility statement. One of the more interesting things that came out of that suit was also the ruling that all third-party components on their website had to be accessible. They tried to make the case that because it wasn't their code, it didn't have to be accessible, and they were told they were wrong. That if you put this component on your website, it has to be accessible. And that was huge. If you do want to, if you want a kind of more summarized version of the report, after it came out, I spent like the whole weekend reading it and tweeting about it. This is pinned on my Twitter profile if you want to go find it. And I tried to tweet out a lot of the more important high-level nuggets from the report. So I do want to leave, I know we want to make some time for questions, but I want to leave you with some really high level, this is what you should do if you care about accessibility and want to make accessible websites with fancy JavaScript, is to learn HTML. If you have never sat down with the HTML5 spec and read it from top to bottom, I highly recommend it. As I said earlier, the more comfortable you can become with HTML and how it's supposed to be used, the easier the rest will be. A lot of times we have these problems because people are using invalid HTML. They're using spans instead of buttons. Things like this, that's really common. It's really easy to throw like a span or a div on a page and then go in JavaScript and add an event listener to it and make it a button, but that's not a true button. And as far as HTML is concerned, that's invalid. So, it doesn't tell the person who can't use a mouse that what they've come to on the page is a button that has action. So this is why it's important to use HTML correctly, because your users and these assistive technologies depend on that. Learn ARIA and WCAG. So we talked about ARIA a little bit. Definitely dive in and learn as much ARIA as you can. There's lots of roles. There's lots of ARIA attributes. Especially if you're creating a complex application, you can take your usability to the next level by implementing ARIA, which will allow you to send more detailed information to your user. Also, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Definitely give this a look over and become familiar with these guidelines, because that will also help you decrease your accessibility issues. It will allow you to become more familiar with these common issues, and they even walk you through how to remediate them and how to solve for them. Do automated testing. And there are lots of tools out there, whether or not you like the command line or you like in-browser testing, whatever your workflow is, use whatever's best for your workflow, but implement automated testing that will scan your HTML or your JavaScript or your really compiled, front end, and it will help you catch a lot. It won't catch everything, but it will get you a good step forward. And also, a nice byproduct of these automated tests is that they spit out what's wrong, and they tell you how to fix it. And so over time, most of them tell you how to fix it. And so over time, it's another way you're becoming familiar with these issues that you can fix before they become an issue. So highly recommend getting some kind of automated testing in your development workflow. And most importantly, user testing. Automated testing will only get you part of the way. When you are building out a page, tap through it with your keyboard. And can you interact with your web page with only the keyboard? If you can't, then there's a problem. I highly recommend getting a screen reader set up. If you're on Mac, get familiar with VoiceOver. If you're on a PC, there are other tools. There's an open source tool called NVDA that you can use. And become familiar with that. Walk through your website with the screen reader and see what it's like. Hear what it's like, excuse me, for those who can't see your webpage. I keep this resources page pretty populated and fairly up to date. So I highly recommend visiting this page on the campus website, where we list out a lot of these resources and tools that you can use. Play around with a few of them, become familiar with something, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, there's probably something else you can use. There's a lot of open source tools out there, a lot of free tools. If you are buying a third-party product, let's say you're buying a theme or you're buying a forms plugin or something like that, where there's lots of front-end markup and you're not really sure if it's accessible before you buy it, a pro tip is to take advantage of in-browser testing tools to evaluate product demos before you buy them. So there's lots of in-browser testing tools, lots of Chrome extensions, lots of Firefox stuff. There's Google Lighthouse that you can run in the developer tools window. There's Axe, there's all kinds of things. There's WebAIM. Most of the automated testing tools have browser versions. Another tip that I like to share with people, especially in regard to JavaScript, since focus is such an issue and a common issue of making sure that you are managing where the focus lies for your keyboard users. A way to manage this is to add extremely bold, highlighted outlandish CSS to a global focus selector. And so then as you move your focus throughout the page with your keyboard, you can always visualize where the focus lies. So you have focus on a button, and then you click the button and the DOM moves around. That highlighted focus selector should stay or should move when appropriate. But that way you at least know that the keyboard user or the assistive technology user who relies on that focus isn't losing it. Because when they lose it, what happens mostly is they have to go back to the top of the page and then navigate back down to where they were. And that is confusing and it's not expected. And so any help you can give there, super great. I found this trick really helps me out. So before we go, another little pitch for campus. Join us July 25th is workshops. Those won't be streamed, but July 26th and 27th, we have 2 full days of sessions, 3 different tracks. Lots of great discussions. It's all free thanks to Pantheon. Hope you come and join us. And then if you want to say hi, you can find me on the Twitters and on my website. You can join us in campus. If you are not a member of the WP Campus community, it's super easy to join. Go to wpcampus.org. There's a Get Involved page, which will get you into our Slack, which is where we are most active.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I know that we have a couple of questions hanging out in the Q&A. So the first question is, I have a question about the building. I'm guessing I have a question about theme building. Is there a good example for building accessible WordPress themes?
Yes. I'll do another pitch for something that I work on called WP Rig. which is a WordPress starter theme that one of our top priorities is accessibility. And so it is an accessible theme that you can use as an example if you like. wprig.io, I think, is the homepage. If not, it's on GitHub also. And we just launched version 2.0. I personally built the menu. One of the more common issues with WordPress themes and themes in general and websites in general is inaccessible menus, especially when they are tiered. So you have those drop downs. And usually the problem lies with keyboard accessibility and not being able to like tab through the menu and access the menu. And so inside that theme is a good example of an accessible drop-down menu. So if you're looking for that, that's probably one of the more common components. So definitely for that, I'm sure there are others. In the WordPress repo, there's an accessibility tag that you can use to find accessible themes. And yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. Our next question is, I work for a very small business and labor costs are tight. Sadly, many of our customers don't understand the internet, let alone the need for an accessible web. Is there an easy set of tools to incorporate accessibility, or is it always rewrite everything? From Eric.
From Eric. Hi, Eric. Well, that is a great question and a hard one to answer because you're probably not going to like the answer. I don't think you necessarily have to just rewrite everything if your website isn't accessible. At the very least, what I do encourage people is baby steps are fine. You know, if it's all you can fix this week is this one issue, then go in and fix that, and it's better than nothing. So I wouldn't say that there is a set of tools because accessibility is not a thing that you can just kind of throw a tool on and it's going to fix your problems. Most likely, normally, in that case, it would make it worse because you're just layering on complexity instead of it's a Band-Aid instead of actually fixing the problem. And that's not even a good analogy because it's not even a Band-Aid. But highly recommend just try to focus. If you don't have a lot of time to just rewrite everything, which you probably don't have to rewrite it anyway, because there are definitely a lot of components to your site that probably are just fine. Just focus on what you can, like make a list of the issues and just go in and change one thing at a time. And then over time, it will get better and you won't feel so overwhelmed that you had to rewrite the whole thing at one time. I do that all the time. Like I run scans on my stuff frequently, and every blue moon I'll find something that snuck through, or I made a change in a hurry, didn't catch, or or a WordPress plugin that I use had an update, and now there's an issue, or introduce an issue somewhere else. Anyway, my point is that I'll find these small issues all the time, and then it feels really good to just go in. It took me a few minutes to fix it, deploy it, and I made a real change, and it didn't. It took me a few minutes. I didn't have to sit down and rewrite my whole theme just to fix that one thing. And over time, that stuff can add up.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this. It has been a pleasure to have you, as always.